everyone, I'm Marina. I am the corporate liaison for White Hat and fourth-year computer science major, all those things. And today I'm going to talk about the GDPR and what that is and why it's interesting. Cool. So this is what it stands for: Global Data Protection Regulation. It's basically it's a new privacy regulation that is being implemented everywhere in Europe. That has to do with transfer of data, data anonymization, and the conditions for consent for sharing and collecting data for EU citizens. This kind of general overview. Go into more detail about all that stuff as we go on. Before we do that, I'm going to talk about my understanding of this. I haven't read the entire text of the document, but I've read lots of summaries and analyses of it. And I'm going to talk about how it relates to the security industry and kind of things of interest that I found in my research. What I'm not going to talk about is whether you are compliant with the GDPR. Anything like that you should talk to a lawyer about. I'm not a lawyer. That's what that slide is. Okay. So, but aside from that, so why do you care about the GDPR? So you're in the US, Europe is kind of far away, so why does this affect you? So it doesn't just apply to companies in Europe. It applies to any company that does business in Europe. So if you have a website, say, that people access from Europe, then the GDPR also applies to you. And they implemented some really big fines for companies that don't comply that apply to companies that are outside of Europe. So I have the exact numbers written later, but very big fines that a lot of people are very worried about. So before we get into that, though, I'm going to talk about a bit about the history and kind of how we got here, and kind of the history of privacy regulations in Europe, and a little bit in the United States, and how those have led to the situation we're in today. So the very first set of kind of privacy regulations were created actually in the 1980s by both I think the EU was around then, but European countries and the United States. They all got together and talked about we have this internet thing. What are we going to do about transferring data across international borders? Because they realized that this was going to become a problem and a thing of interest in the future. So they created these guidelines. And I'll go through them really quickly because they kind of build the foundation for everything else in the future. So the first one is the guidelines on that's what it stands for, sorry. The guidelines on the protection of privacy and transport flows of personal data. Basically what I just said about how we do data on this internet thing. Okay, so here's what they are. The first one is the collection limitation principle. So this is basically limiting the collection of data to data that you need, information that's relevant for whatever your company does or your website does. The next one is the data quality principle. I wrote this one down because I thought it was interesting. It's the full wording of it. Personal data should be relevant to the purposes for which they are used, and to the extent necessary for those purposes should be accurate, complete, and kept up to date. So basically, any data that you collect should be useful and accurate. You shouldn't just collect random garbage. Purpose specification principle. This one was you should tell people why you're collecting their data. Use limitation, just use data for what you said. Security safeguards principle. This one's also pretty interesting. It's basically that you should properly secure people's private data once you collect it, which I think is something that it definitely becomes interesting as we go through history when people didn't necessarily do this, and we get all kinds of data breaches and stuff like that. So those all break this principle in some way or another. The openness principle, which is basically openness between the person whose data is collected and the people who collected the data, kind of what's happening with the data, why it's being used, that kind of thing. And the individual participation principle, which basically you should have a right to know how your data is being used, and it's about the individual. And the accountability principle, which means that basically people should actually be accountable. This, I think, is the number one thing that they messed up in these guidelines, because they're exactly that, they're guidelines. The idea was that people would take these guidelines and then make national laws that would kind of make them happen. But in practice, it was a really good idea. Yeah. So a few years later, because policy moves very quickly, so this was 15 years later, they were like, okay, so no one actually, we have all these crazy, ridiculous laws. Some of them are kind of like the guidelines. Some of them are nothing like the guidelines. No one really knows how to follow these. They're not really enforceable. So they realized there was a problem. So the EU got together and had this directive. I think that's probably just some numbering system for general EU directives. And so this is more specific. for the EU. So the idea was to bring together all these disparate privacy laws that I was talking about. And one of the big things that this added was requirements for transfer of data outside of the EU. And I think this was where the idea of protected areas was introduced. Like, do we trust the countries we're sending data to? Like the difference between sending data to like a close ally, like the US, versus somebody who may not be an ally, some other country. But another problem with this one is it's also a directive. We still haven't gotten this word law. So the directive meant that people had to do something that was similar to this directive, but it's still not a law. So that's where we are today. And then a few years ago, people got together and like, okay, we still don't have a unified privacy laws. So that's where we got to the GDPR. So it is a regulation, which means for the EU, a regulation becomes law in all member states as soon as it's passed. So basically, it's like an EU-wide law. And they made a lot of updates for things like cloud storage and social media that didn't exist in the 1980s when those original guidelines were created, just to make this a lot more relevant for like the internet today. And like I said, it applies to everyone in the EU. And actually, because of the wording of it, it applies to anyone who's like currently in the EU, regardless of citizenship. Cool, so this is kind of some of the enforcement stuff, which all those previous versions were missing. So it applies to, anyone that handles data of people in the EU, which is basically any company that uses the internet. And also server locations are super interesting because most people don't know where their servers are, and there's a lot of servers that exist in Europe. So if your server is in Europe, then this also applies to you, even if you're not collecting data on people in Europe because your data is traveling through Europe. And the penalties are, if you don't comply, starting in May of this year, is 4% of your company's annual turnover or $20 million, whichever is higher. So it's a lot of money. Especially if you think of some of the bigger companies, their annual turnover is a lot more than $20 million, so or euros. And new conditions, and there are also new conditions for what consent of giving data means. Because if you've ever read a privacy policy, I have, but I know most people haven't, they're notoriously very long and unreadable. One of the new things that the GDPR added is that your privacy policy has to be intelligible, and they have like guidelines for that, but basically it can't be all legalese. It has to be understandable by a layperson and clear. And it also you also have to be able to give consent and withdraw consent very easily. Like you just be able to like log on, uncheck a box, and you withdrew consent for your data to be collected and for your data to be had. Yes?
That withdrawal of consent, is that regulated so that you don't have to give up use of the service in order to withdraw consent?
Yes, generally. So
in most cases, you can still use the service without consent?
Yeah, so the idea is that the use of your service should not be, relying on consent. Like if it's not truly consent if you say, okay, well, if you don't give consent, you can't use Google, because using Google is a part of everyday life, and like in today's world, and if you can't look stuff up on the internet, then you can't really be a participant in society. So part of what they said is that consent includes, you have to be able to use parts of the service, even if you don't give consent for other parts of the service. Yes?
There would be some services that you couldn't, like some services are built on.
Yes, I have an interesting one later, because like this hasn't actually been enforced yet for another few months. So this is definitely going to be one of the points of interest to look at, because especially like location-based services like Google Maps is a very different service when you don't have location. You can use it, but it's just a very different service. There's other things like that. Yeah.
Do we know where the penalty money ends up going, or does it just go to whatever?
It goes to like probably the EU, some regulatory committee that then does something with it. I'm not sure exactly. Yeah. And that's actually one of the interesting arguments against like kind of conspiracy theories that I've heard about the law, is that, it's a lot of money. Okay. So, and there's also a lot of new rights. So it kind of includes most of those OECD guidelines that I talked about earlier, but it also adds a few new things that I'll just highlight. It's kind of like the general overview of what's being enforced. So breach notifications, this is a big one. So if data is, like if there's a breach, and if you have a database with personal data and it's breached, you have to tell people within 72 hours. of the breach happening. And actually, you have to tell, that's for the people whose data it is. There's other groups of people who you sometimes have to tell before 72 hours. So this is actually that's the nice version. The right to access. So if you gave someone data, they have to tell you how and why the data is accessed and what data that they have. The right to be forgotten. This is, I'll talk about this a little bit more later, but this one's really interesting. It's the right to erase all of your data that somebody has. And this one, there's a few snags in it that are really interesting. Data portability. So this is, so if you give your data to one service and you decide the service is terrible and you hate the service, they have to be able to give you the data in a form such that you can give it to somebody else, and they're now providing that service. Yeah. Privacy by design, there's some requirements that your service, you kind of have to be able to prove that your service looked at privacy from the beginning of building the product, not just tacked on afterward. I think we talk a lot about security by design. This is a very similar concept. It also involves a lot of security by design, just thinking about all the steps of collection. Yes?
Is there some kind of grandfather clause though? I imagine some people did not meet these requirements have to bolt.
That's really interesting. I actually don't know. I think it's probably, you can't do that specific thing, but I think you do have to bolt on a lot of measures to comply with a lot of the rest of the other areas. So yeah. And finally, we have this idea of data protection officers, which is someone internal at the company whose basically their job is to interface between the GDPR and any changes and the company. And certain companies are required to have data protection officers to comply. Mostly big companies, like if you're 2 people, you don't need one, but if you're I don't know the numbers, but yeah, some big companies need data protection officers. The jobs are basically internal record keeping, and they have to have contact info that's posted publicly, so that if you have a privacy concern, you can email this person directly. Is the idea? Yeah. Yeah. So now we get to some of the problems with some of those previous things, or at least challenges. So this first one, finding and erasing data. Databases are really weird. And some of the databases that are used, especially for things like AI or advertising, you get these big networks of data, and you don't really know where those pieces of data came from. You just know that they're part of this big network of data. But people need to be able to find what data they have about someone and potentially erase it from this big network system that they have put in place. This one is especially hard to do afterward. A lot of companies in the past year or so have been struggling with, because if they already have this big system with data, they have to figure out, how to organize that. Yes, that one's really interesting. Compatible data formats. Similarly, you have this data and you have your own custom format that's really great for whatever application your company does to process data. And then there's some other person, you don't want to give away your proprietary format, but there's a lot of work to transfer that data format. So yeah, another interesting problem. And the privacy by design, like we talked about a little bit, it's a problem both kind of what do companies do now, and also how does this work? I think there's a bit of research in this area, but I think it's definitely going to become a much bigger area now that there's this requirement. Yeah. Yes.
The finding and erasing data, is there a time limit on that too? I know some companies there's a timeout where you don't want to erase it right away because it was a mistake.
So I'm going to come back to that again in a minute. But actually, interestingly, the idea is trust the person first, verify later, is the current model that they have, which there's some problems with that I will bring up because.
Backups? What happens if we get it?
Yeah, backups. Yeah, that's the other thing I was going to mention. Yeah, backups are really interesting because. And also, there is a clause that I did forget to mention, which is that if a company can argue that it's in if there's a law that says that they have to keep the data, or if it's in the public interest, and there's obviously requirements for that, then they don't have to erase the data, etc. If it's I don't know, some sort of public database or something like that. But yeah, backups are another interesting one. Okay, so here's the first kind of interesting problem. That kind of relates to how these things are actually implemented once they hit real-world problems. So WHOIS databases are basically, so ICANN requires that registrant, anyone who has a domain. So ICANN is kind of the international authority that is in charge of domains. I don't remember what it stands for. International something. Does anyone know? No, okay. It basically, so they have like, if you have like google.com or whatever, Google got that by asking ICANN probably through a third party to get that domain. Probably not through a third party anymore, but anyway. They require registrants to list info on the Who Am I directory. So basically, if you buy a domain, you have to put some information about yourself, like a contact info and some other stuff, into this directory, so that if stuff is up with the domain, people can contact you. And it's required with the registration of domain by ICANN guidelines. At least that's true as of like 5 years ago. So in 2015, they created this idea of privacy proxies, so that instead of you personally registering a domain with your email address, you hire like a company or something like that to register the domain for you. They put their email address on this public registry. Your email address stays private. You don't have to have your information be public. The problem is that these are often paid services, and a paid service does not meet the idea of consent set forward by the GDPR. It has to be free, basically. It has to be what's it called? It has to be opt-in. Or, sorry, yeah. Opt-out, not opt-in, basically. You can't, basically you can't have to pay extra for privacy. I think I got the ops wrong, but yeah. So in 2017, ICANN was like, oh wait, this GDPR thing is happening. We have a lot of people that live in Europe. What are we gonna do about it? And so they proposed a lot of solutions. The main problem is that there are certain third parties who need to have this information. Think like federal governments for various abuse cases, certain content posted online that really shouldn't be online, that kind of thing. So they have to have some process for giving data to third parties. The interesting thing, though, is that the way ICANN proposed these is they had like 3 different proposals. One of them was proposed giving data to any third party that asked for it, because they said they could. The second proposal is a little bit better. It's giving data to people on an authorized list, but then this gives ICANN the authority to authorize a list, which is kind of interesting. Option number 3 is probably what will actually be implemented, hopefully, which is giving it just to like governments with warrants and that kind of whole established process that most governments have already. But then it has to deal with each individual country and however many of those there are in the world. So it's still a big problem. Yeah.
Do you know how that would work with like DMCA takedown notices?
Yeah, so that's kind of the main reason that people need to have this information, is that the DMCA takedown needs to go to someone. Yeah. So the idea is, I think that if you have the warrant for the DMCA takedown, you'd be able to get the information that you need to send the email to do the thing. And also, the person who has the domain can take down the domain without your consent. So if you like fail to comply with something, then whoever you bought the domain from can just like kick you off eventually. Yeah.
Is the proposal to conform with for any countries or just for certain countries?
I didn't read specifically enough to answer that. Sorry. It's a good question.
Yeah, because otherwise, like, so for example, can Zimbabwe start writing up warrants?
That is interesting. Yes. Yeah.
Does the DMCA have any international? Because isn't that Digital Millennial Millennium?
Yeah, DMCA is a U.S. law, so it mostly applies to U.S. websites and companies. There's a lot of actually part of it is that whatever the end of that domain is says which country it belongs to. Like a .com is a U.S. one, a .uk, .co or whatever is a UK one, etc. So I think it's probably still broken down by country code enforcement, if I had to guess, but that's a guess. So yeah. Yeah.
So then, for example, if it were a .com, then only a U.S. warrant could get it?
Probably. I have no idea.
The DMCA takedown notice is that you don't need a warrant.
Yeah, I'd have to look into that specifically. Sorry, I didn't actually look at DMCA. Yeah. And I think there'll probably be an interesting case about it in the next year or so to look out for, because, again, this isn't actually enforced yet. Yeah. And this is all especially interesting when you consider anti-abuse, because oftentimes anti-abuse is done at the registrar level, not at the national level. And so because the national courts don't have time to deal with all the anti-abuse cases that happen, and whether or not registrars can access that data is another interesting question to deal with anti-abuse. And that's kind of why this whole thing is as big of a question as it is. Yes?
What about
They do require it to do their business.
Yeah, so they do require it. However, privacy proxies are oftentimes third-party services. And so you can like do layers of indirection, basically. I think there's nothing here that says that, what are they called? Registrars can't just take down your domain if they think it's doing inappropriate things that they don't want to support. But yeah. Okay, another interesting one is that Great Britain is not going to be part of the EU soon. And so what does that mean for this law? Or England? I don't know exactly. Sorry, I get the terms confused. So with, so that's supposed to say now, that first one.
UK, Great Britain is just a geological.
Geological? So I get them all confused. Yes, it's supposed to say UK, sorry. So for now, the GDPR applies because England is still a part of Europe for now. Once they leave, it doesn't apply. They'll probably implement their own version. What they've said is that they're going to copy-paste the GDPR and make that their law. But as they make changes to the GDPR, those changes may or may not be reflected in whatever England's version is. And this is going to be another really interesting area. Also, this last note, what happens when you transfer data from England to like Germany? Does that count as it leaving the EU? Does it not? It probably will, at least initially, and they have to like figure out their terms. But yeah, this is going to be another really interesting one. Yes?
You mentioned that the British government said that they would copy-paste. Do you know who said that?
No, sorry.
Because that sounds like not at all
But
like the opposite.
So basically, it didn't say they'd copy-paste it. The prevailing theory is that there's a lot of EU law that Britain uses because they've been in the EU for a while, and they can't just like throw out all that law and be fine in a day. So the prevailing theory is what they're going to do is they're basically going to re-implement most of the EU laws as their laws, at least temporarily, and then maybe change some of them, maybe not, whatever, depending on the law, and go from there, rather than just like wiping it all out, because there's just a lot of, like some of the laws are really relevant and like important. So, is there another question? Okay. But yeah, I'm sure some laws they won't do that with, but I don't know what those are. Yeah.
One thing I guess this maybe do it is what happens like the intersection of these laws? It seems like too many countries implement laws that have different requirements.
Yeah.
Nothing you can do.
That's another really interesting thing because the EU is basically forcing international companies to do a thing to do business in Europe. And what certain, especially smaller business companies type things are doing is they're saying, okay, we'll no longer market to a European market because it's too much work. If you have to like go through a proxy or whatever from Europe to get to a product, that doesn't really count as it being in Europe, if that makes sense. So they can't force anyone who's like has a website that's only designed to ever being used at Cal Poly to comply with the GDPR because it's kind of out of scope. But yeah, so that's an interesting problem. Like if you're a small enough country, people just won't let you use their site. So Europe thinks they can get away with it because they're a big enough group of people. Yes.
So that kind of touched on a question that I was gonna ask at the end, but it's sort of a large question. Do you want me to save it to the end?
Go for it. I just have a couple more things.
So why should I'm not saying anything against Google or any other companies.
Yeah.
I'm just using them as an example of a very large American company. Why do they need to comply with this?
Because there's people in Europe that have a lot of money that they want to have access to.
But why? So why can't they just say, no, we're not going to obey this law?
Most companies actually have it. If you have an office in Europe, you 100% have to obey with this law. Most.
If Europe said you broke the law, pay off, and they said no.
That is going to be really interesting. I agree. So I think, yeah, the case where they have an office in Europe is the easy case. The case where they don't have an office in Europe is a little bit more interesting. Yeah.
I think insurance is just going to seize your assets.
Because like.
Right, if you really don't comply, they'll seize everything you have in Europe.
Like the US and the EU are pretty close allies, and so I'm sure there'd be like some sort of an agreement that they have. I don't know what that is.
Okay, but let's say maybe like Kaspersky.
Okay.
What if Kaspersky don't they run a thing?
Yeah, that's why like things like torrenting sites or whatever are never hosted out of the US is because this exact problem. The internet is weird.
Yeah.
And it's hard to force national laws on international things. That's kind of part of what this is trying to solve. On the other hand, it's kind of creating the same problem. So, yeah.
Also, how would that work if, say, the data is collected in Europe? Say you have a server that serves your front end, but none of the data is stored.
If the data travels through Europe, this applies. whatever that means for your company. And I think usually if your front end is there, there's at least things hitting it that involve, say, IP addresses and stuff, which I don't remember if they count, but yeah. Anything else before we move on?
So, also, does that only apply to like fixed nodes? Because
Yeah, so I don't remember. I remember reading something about that. So fixed nodes are the big interesting one because they're in Europe always. But I think anything that uses a server that is physically located in the general region of Europe is definitely an
say
option.
for like larger routing things, something could just temporarily go through.
I believe that would count. I'm not positive.
Yeah, so people have to route around Europe if they
If they want to be.
That sounds like it's going to be a wormhole.
Because, and also like the way pipes are set up, like there's not like, if in order to get data to say, I know there's a couple interesting ones, like to get data to Canada, it has to go through the US. To get data to New Zealand, it has to go through Australia, and a couple other really interesting things because of the way the actual physical infrastructure of the internet is set up. So stuff like that is going to be really interesting.
Or sharks continue to attack the cables of
Yeah.
and suddenly the only way to talk to anyone is to go through Europe.
Yeah. Yes, that is a question. Okay, so this is another really interesting thing that I think was not fully thought through. Free expression. So if you can take, so there's this idea that you can request to remove data. The problem is that it's really hard to verify who you are on the internet. This is just kind of a general problem in security, and it comes into play here. So even if the data was provided by a third party about you, you could say, this data is not accurate, I want this data taken down, whatever. So what does this do to the journalism, which I think is a really interesting thing to think about that I don't think was fully thought through. There's actually really interesting, if you're interested in more about this, the EFF wrote a really interesting basically brief to the EU saying these are things you should fix soon. They published it, I think it was like 6 months ago. I have not seen anything saying that they've fixed these problems. So, yeah. Oh no, sorry, 6 months before the GDPR was passed, not 6 months before now. But yeah. Anyway, continuing on this, you don't need to notify a content provider that the data is produced. So say the data that is hosted here, this person provided the data and you are here, right? So this data is about you, that this person gave this content provider, which is now posting it on this website. You over here were like, that data is wrong, I don't want that data up, whatever. You didn't actually post that data. Like, you're probably who you say you are. You ask this person to take it down. They're required by the GDPR to take down that data without necessarily notifying this content provider that gave you the data. And yeah, so if you can see any potential for attackers, yeah. And the review of whether or not this was a valid request takes place after the content removal. And review processes are not always very quick, speedy things, so it could be like months later, oh yeah, oops, here's the content again, the election passed, oh well, or whatever. And again, there's no verification of the person who's filing the request, partly because identity is a really hard problem on the internet. And so requiring verification just kind of adds a whole layer of cryptography to something that they want to make easy. So, yeah. And that actually, another interesting thing about this part is that the data portability question and the idea of right to view your own data is there's also no verification. Like, how do you prove this is my data, I want it back? But if you posted data here, somebody else says, oh, this is my data, I want it back, that data is required to be given to that person within some number of days. And then you might find out about it later, but they already have all your data. So some interesting potential attacks that I think might come up and hopefully will be fixed. They might have been fixed. I couldn't find any evidence that they had been, but I might have missed it. So anyway. What is going to happen in the near future? So this whole GDPR thing is going to become enforceable on May 25th of this year. So that's kind of when these fines start, when lawsuits are going to start happening based on various things related to this policy. So it'll be something interesting to look for, and hopefully you'll have some background once those all start coming up. Yeah. These are some resources that I used to find some information. If you have any questions that I'm not able to answer. They're probably included somewhere there. Yeah. And then, do you have any more questions? You probably can't see the XKCD, and I apologize. Yeah.
So, one thing I came up with right before I forgot, like, you kind of mentioned it with deletes. It's also like, where does that stop, right? Because like it sounds great for most average people to say, I want to be seen on the internet. So
yeah.
At the same time, like, if you do something newsworthy, like at what point is that no longer data?
Yeah. There is a clause about data being for like the public interest or whatever. So if you're like a public figure, and if you're like, so there's like the non-gray area where if you're a public figure, like say you're like, I don't know, some elected official, you do a thing in public, it's a whole public thing, like that probably couldn't be taken down. The problem is that it would probably have to be taken down initially, done a review process, and then put back up because of the way it's written. But that's kind of what would happen there. On the other end, if it's just you, it's pretty easy. There's a lot of space in between there where you're like kind of public, you did a thing that was public, but you're a private person, and I think that's a really interesting area. So I think that'll be for precedent to decide once that starts happening. Yeah.
I don't know much about legal stuff in the EU. Is there a unified EU court system that this will go through, or does it go through each country's courts individually?
I don't remember. I think they have some sort of system, but it might have to do with individual. Do you know?
I think there's a specific GDPR review board.
Oh yeah, they totally created a board to review cases.
So there's like a committee that will hear all.
It's probably like based on like people from all different countries or whatever. But yeah.
Cool. Yeah.
Yeah.
Still don't see why any other country, like anything one that's not based in Europe would.
Lots of people are. Like Facebook is doing a bunch of changes to their privacy policy changed a bunch recently, and a bunch of stuff that is pretty obviously tied to this.
It's very weird.
What?
But they have offices.
Most big Trump companies have at least one European office, partly because time zones. And it's way easier to have an office around the world.
Well, I think if you're a global company, you have almost no choice.
Yeah, if
you weren't required to cut out European customers and market and access.
Yeah, if you're like top 100 companies, you don't really have a choice but to comply. There's, I think, definitely an area where on the smaller company scale where it will be a big step for companies to move into the European market in the future. So that'll be interesting.
If you're in top 100 companies and you don't have an office in Europe, then like, why would you comply to this?
Can you name a top 100 company that doesn't have an office in Europe?
I don't know. Well, I couldn't name the top 100 companies.
It's not if you have an office in Europe. It's if your service.
Your service. Yeah, if you have a server in Europe.
Goes to Europe.
If you want faster speeds in Europe, you have a server in Europe. Like.
Yeah, what I'm saying is Europe's, unless you have an office in Europe, they can't seize your assets.
If you have a server in Europe, they can seize that.
Okay, they can take your own server. What I'm saying is, let's say you have a server. Let's say that you have a server right outside of the European Union, in whatever country is.
But in Switzerland.
But like, okay.
You have a server in Switzerland.
I think, is that part of the EU?
Switzerland is not part of the EU.
Then why ever pay the fine? Okay, I don't know.
Or whatever. Okay, I think this comes back to like the general problem with laws and the internet is that we don't have an international court system. We have like the UN kind of, but there's no way to enforce any one country's or one group of countries' laws on the entire internet. There's like lots of things with allies and treaties and all kinds of stuff that does kind of a patchy job of it, but there's no like. It's the same thing with like DMCA and like the reason that is still a problem today. If everything was in the U.S., they probably would have solved that problem, but it's not. It's all over the world. So, yeah. Mm-hmm.
The U.S. government has also like really turned against Silicon Valley very recently, and so I can totally see like EU and U.S. government agreeing to like fine U.S. companies.
Yeah, and I think that U.S. companies having to comply is hardly a question. The U.S. and EU are pretty big allies. I think that there's a couple other countries that I think would be really interesting to see how that happens, because it's a lot of money for the company and the country to lose if those fines happen.
And the fines go up for breaching offensively, right?
So the way it works, where's the numbers that I have? Yeah, so these numbers, so it's half of those numbers in certain cases, and those full numbers in other certain cases. It mostly depends on the severity, not so much. I think repeat probably increases severity, but I don't remember exactly how that works.
It's a lot of money.
Yeah, It's a lot of money. And if you think about like the numbers of global turnover of some companies,
Facebook's what, like 120 billion?
yeah, that's in dollars, but yeah, whatever that is in euros. So, and it's global annual turnover too, not European annual turnover, but yeah.
So is there any way for us to like leverage the protections of these laws as U.S. citizens residing in the U.S.?
I don't think so. I actually even looked into European citizens living in the U.S., and it doesn't really seem to apply there. It seems mostly to apply to people who are physically in Europe, whether or not they're EU citizens. If you're a U.S. citizen and you are hanging out in Germany for a month, these laws apply to you. But if you are an EU citizen who decides to visit California, they probably don't apply.
It's probably going to get very hard to proxy through Europe.
Yes.
Yeah, if you proxy through Europe, then who's to say that you're not hanging out in Germany?
Exactly.
So, wait,
Yeah.
Will this create a market? So if I have some, so let's say that I want to be forgotten. Can I get on a plane, fly to Germany, put in my request, chill in Germany for a month until my request goes through, and then fly back to the US?
That's a really good question.
Because that's a tourism market right there.
Yeah.
Actually answer that because we talked about it in the 300 class. In fact, we talked pretty much exactly about the right to be forgotten. And basically it boils down to if you submit a right to be forgotten, then it will filter the, it will basically remove those entries from, say, Google, but only in Europe. You can still find those in the US. So,
that makes
for
sense.
example, if you are forgotten in Europe and you want to dig up some dirt on your competitors and they got forgotten by Google, you can just VPN to US. And
That's really interesting. I wonder if that still complies with the GDPR too, because I don't know. I would have to read it more carefully. That's really interesting.
I'm imagining like when you fly to certain countries and it's like, are you coming here for healthcare?
Oh, yeah.
Are you coming here to be forgotten?
Yeah.
There's like the malicious reasons, but not malicious reasons. Like some countries will also ask Google to take stuff down.
Yeah.
But they will prefer to be uncensored everywhere else.
Yeah, I think Holocaust denial is illegal in most European countries.
Well, it's more that like some of the more interesting countries like Turkey and them will also ask for stuff. And
Yeah.
It's easier for them to offer at least the limited Google service down there. So they'll take it down there, and then anywhere else will be available.
Yeah. Yes, I guess there are already certain region-specific blocking that exists, especially if you think of like China. There's like tons that they're doing for regional blocking, so it's something that's possible.
And Google left that market, right?
I believe they did. Apple chose not to.
But
Yeah.
But sort of, I think going back to the point you said, if you VPN into another country, then the GDPR no longer applies.
Probably. You probably couldn't. You couldn't bring it to court because you're physically someplace. Your computer's physically yeah.
So even though that data is going through Europe,
I'm not positive. I believe if you are the one sending the data through Europe, it's slightly different than if the company is the one sending the data through Europe. Because if you are bouncing your own data, it's still your data at that point. You haven't given it to a company yet. But again, that'll be interesting to see in the future. Because you can still like broadcast your data around the world and no one's going to stop you. It's more like what happens once it hits a company. Ooh, and one other interesting thing that I didn't mention, I don't remember when I was going to mention it, is the relationship between a company and a third party with your data. So oftentimes company will hire external, say, advertisers or whatever, and give them a lot of data. A lot of the clauses of GDPR, the first person you give your data to is responsible for it, even if they give it to another person. So they're kind of responsible for these third parties and whether or not they're actually complying, which is kind of interesting.
yes.
Yeah, the routing problem I think is going to be one of the big ones. Again, like none of these are actually like solved problems yet. People, we don't actually know what they're going to actually enforce, which parts they're not, like that kind of thing. But
Your London School of Economics is taking law students right now.
yeah, and actually one of the interesting things for all of us here is that a lot of these problems become technical problems really quickly and become security problems even more quickly when you start talking about encryption of data and how it's being transmitted, and yeah.
When they say it's portable, they just hand you an encrypted blob and be like, have fun.
See, like I don't think that would count. I think there's, I don't, again, like it's all written in legalese, but there's some sort of like it has to be like readable. But I think human and machine readable
So I can just give you a printed out PDF.
It can't be printed.
Fuck.
Actually, there's a lot of clauses about how it has to be digital. And most of the stuff has to be digital. You can't just like print out stacks of paper.
Pay the fines and singles or something.
Yeah. Yeah. That's actually one of the things that I remember reading, that they've thought about the whole printing out the data thing.
Here's 4 billion euro coins.
Yeah.
How does the right to be forgotten interact with Merkle trees?
Yes.
Oh.
Yeah. Anyone that's marketing data storage and blockchains cannot implement right to be forgotten.
Yes. Yeah, I think Merkle chains are another really interesting one. The whole AI distributed database, Merkle chains. There's a lot of ways that we store data that are not super changeable.
I was going to say, does it apply to derived data too? Like, maybe I have some scores for proprietary machine
Yeah,
learning.
and I
do
think
have to
that-
disclose those, or do I have to disclose the raw data you gave me and I just print it back?
I don't know. And I think another interesting thing related to that is like, there's no time limit on this idea of a right to be forgotten. So like if you gave consent for like a study 20 years ago or whatever, and you now want your data to be taken out, like are those published results now no longer viable? Like what's the limit on that? And I think data in aggregate is different than data in individually, but yeah.
My data can live on as part of the aggregated machine learning.
Yeah.
Like, oh, it's anonymized in that model somewhere.
Yeah, I think that if it's like anonymized enough and aggregate enough, whatever those are defined as, yeah.
So what about? I'm sorry. We keep, like,
No, this is fine. This is interesting. This is cool. We're doing it on time.
So another interesting question is, what about like not a priori, like a posteriori data? So synthesized data. So-
Give me an example. Sorry.
So I give you the data that I visited a golf shop, and I visited a sporting shoes shop, and I visited some other golf related shop. And you, from that synthesize, Nick likes golf. Now I ask to be forgotten. Do you just have to get rid of those 3, or do I also have to get rid of any synthesized data from that?
I believe, because you do have to talk about how the data is processed, and I think because of that, the aggregate data would be included, but I'm not positive. Like the data, yeah.
Get even more tangible in it. Like, let's say, well, we measured the person's location 3 times, and there's 3 dots around their house. We take an average point. Okay, maybe we can delete those 3 points, but we still have a dot in the middle of their house.
Yeah. And yeah, so I believe the dot in the middle of the house is included.
But then, like, how do you draw that line?
But then, aggregate studies are also.
Yeah, because aggregate studies are also kind of like that, but they're not all about one person. Aggregate studies are about 20 different people or whatever.
Data has to be anything associated. So
Yeah.
the fact that it still says your name in some piece of data is not forgotten.
Yeah.
If we created that data associated with your name, that has to go. It's more about back when I was asked about transferring. I don't think they have to necessarily transfer the dot in the middle of the house.
Yeah, they may or may not have to transfer it, but I think they would have to delete
They
it.
wouldn't necessarily have to delete you if your data's been thrown into a pool where I can demonstrate I can
Yeah.
like properly retrieve it and point it to you. Like if your name no longer exists in a meaningful way and no ID I can map to your name exists in a meaningful way, you're probably
Sorry.
So you're saying that if you opt out, it is possible for companies to do what Snapchat does to people who opt out of location services, where they take away like filters and snap maps?
I think it has to be related, but I'm not positive. Like, I don't think they could take away like filters, but they probably take away like the map feature, because that's like directly related to location. I'm not positive exactly the way that's worded, but yeah. I know I actually have a lot of apps that crash when you say no to location. It's a fun experiment.
All right, let's thank our
Okay.
speakers.